Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into a world that's, well, a little different from your average Tuesday night. We're talking Vikings. And not just any Vikings, but specifically Viking women, and a rather eyebrow-raising aspect of their lives, divorce. Yeah, you heard that right. While you might picture Vikings as just horned helmet-wearing, axe-wielding badasses, spoiler, the horned helmets are mostly a myth. Sorry to burst that bubble, their society had some surprisingly complex, and dare I say, progressive social rules, especially when it came to saying thanks, but no thanks to a marriage. You know, it's funny, we often imagine these ancient cultures as incredibly harsh, and in many ways they was. Let's be honest. If you were suddenly dropped into a Viking village, your first day might involve accidentally offending someone powerful by using the wrong kind of spoon, and then, well, it's complicated. You'd probably miss Wi-Fi pretty quickly, let's put it that way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help this little corner of the internet keep going, and it lets me know you're out there, perhaps also in your pajamas, ready for a story. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment below with your city and what time it is for you right now. It's always a bit of a trip for me to see where everyone's tuning in from as we embark on these little historical detours together. I see you, Perth at 9 p.m, and hello to you too, Reykjavik, where it's probably just waking up to a chilly morning. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Alright, so here you are. Close your eyes for a second, or just let them unfocus a bit. Feel the air change. It's cooler now, damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something else, something animal, and undeniably alive. You're standing just inside the doorway of a Viking longhouse. It's vast, much larger than you'd expect, a single, long, cavernous room stretching out before you, the curved timbers of its roof like the ribs of a great beast. Sunlight, or what passes for it on these often grey northern days, struggles to penetrate the gloom, filtering in through high smoke holes in the roof and perhaps a few small, strategically placed openings in the walls, which are likely covered with stretched animal hides rather than glass. You feel the rough-hewn wooden door at your back, solid and heavy. This is your domain. You are the husfreyja, the lady of the house, and the weight of that responsibility settles on your shoulders, as familiar as the woolen shawl you've likely got pinned with a sturdy bronze brooch. Around your waist, or perhaps suspended from that brooch, jingles a set of keys. Not just any keys, these are often beautifully crafted, sometimes iron, sometimes bronze, symbols of your authority here. These aren't just for locking up the good mead, though that's certainly part of it. They signify your control over the household stores, the chests of linen, the preserved foods that will see your family through the long, dark winters. To lose them, or to have them taken, would be a catastrophic loss of status. Your day started before the sun, as it always does. The fire in the central hearth, a long, shallow pit running down the middle of the longhouse, needed coaxing back to life from last night's embers. You can still smell the lingering smoke. It clings to everything: your clothes, your hair, the very fabric of the house. It's a smell you barely notice anymore, as constant as breathing. Some historians argue that the levels of indoor air pollution in these longhouses were, by modern standards, incredibly hazardous, leading to chronic respiratory problems. A little historical for you: your smart air purifier would have a meltdown here. You oversee the morning's tasks. If you have thralls, slaves, a stark reality of Viking society, you direct them. Porridge needs to be made, likely a bland, but filling concoction of barley or oats. Milk from the cows or goats, if you have them and they are nearby, needs to be brought in and perhaps churned into butter, or skyr, that thick, tangy yogurt-like substance. Children tumble underfoot, their noise a constant backdrop. You're probably managing several of your own, plus any young relatives, or foster children, a common arrangement in Norse society. Their education, such as it is, falls largely to you in these early years, a mixture of practical skills, societal norms, and the endless, captivating sagas and myths of your people, told by the flickering firelight. When your husband and the other men of the household are away, perhaps on a trading voyage that could last months, or, yes, on a raiding expedition, let's not romanticize it too much, the entire weight of the farmstead, the livestock, the defenses, and the economic decisions fall squarely on you. This isn't just delegated work, it's genuine authority. You make the calls. You trade with passing merchants, you manage disputes amongst the household staff, you ensure the fields are sown and harvested. It's a mainstream historical understanding that Viking women wielded considerable power within this domestic sphere, especially in the absence of their husbands. But here's a little something to chew on: those keys you carry. Archaeologists have found some incredibly ornate examples, sometimes worn very visibly on a woman's clothing, almost like jewelry. This wasn't just about function, it was a clear, public statement of her role and status. It's like wearing your CEO badge, but for a much draftier, smokier office where the livestock occasionally wanders through. And while we know women managed the household, the actual texture of that power, how it felt day to day when the men were home, is something scholars still gently bicker about. Was it a matriarchal undertone in a patriarchal society? Or was it more a case of, you handle the inside, I'll handle the outside, and don't question my hunting trips? The sagas, often written down centuries later by Christian monks, give us tantalizing glimpses, but also a lens that might distort. The day wears on. You might be weaving cloth, the crucial, time-consuming task, mending clothes, preparing herbs for remedies, or overseeing the brewing of ale, because water wasn't always the safest bet, and a weak ale was a daily drink for everyone, even the children. There's a rhythm to it all, a cycle dictated by seasons and necessity. It's a life of hard work, certainly, but also one of deep connection to your home, your kin, and the tangible results of your labor. As dusk begins to settle, drawing long shadows across the packed earth floor of the longhouse, you ensure the animals are secure, the final meal is prepared, and the house is settled for the night. The fire is banked, the stories perhaps begin, and you, the husfreyja, can finally take a moment, feeling the cool draft from under the door, a reminder of the wild world just outside your sturdy walls. So, you're settled into the rhythm of the longhouse, the keys to its wealth and well-being jingling softly as you move. But how did you, this capable husfreyja, come to be mistress of this particular hearth, alongside this particular Viking? It probably wasn't a whirlwind romance that started with longing glances across a crowded mead hall, though I suppose stranger things have happened even back then. More often than not, your marriage, like most in Norse society, was a carefully constructed bridge between two families, a binding of oaths that had as much to do with land, livestock, and alliances, as it did with any notion of personal affection. Think of it less as a rom-com meet-cute and more as a medieval merger and acquisition, but with more livestock, and probably fewer PowerPoint presentations. You'd likely have had some awareness of the young man, or perhaps not so young widower, chosen for you. He might be from a neighboring farmstead, or perhaps from a clan a day's ride away, one whose lands bordered a valuable fishing spot, or a crucial trade route your family wanted a stake in. The negotiations would have been handled by the men of your respective families, your father, your brothers, perhaps a well-respected uncle, meeting with his. There was often a designated spokesman, a torsmar, who was skilled in these delicate, and sometimes quite tense, negotiations. You can just imagine them, can't you? Two groups of stern-faced Vikings, probably armed, haggling over dowries and property lines with the same intensity they might later use to haggle over the price of walrus ivory. Your own opinion on the matter? Well, that's where things get a little murky. The mainstream understanding is that while a woman's consent wasn't legally required in the earliest periods, it was often considered desirable for a harmonious household. A sullen, unwilling bride wasn't exactly conducive to a smooth-running farm, or a strong family alliance. The sagas sometimes tell of women who did protest, or who had strong preferences, but whether their voices were truly heeded often depended on their family's status, and their own force of personality. Historians still debate the actual level of agency young women had in choosing their partners, or at least in vetoing a particularly undesirable one. It probably varied wildly. A key part of these negotiations was the munda, or bride price. This wasn't your family selling you, as some older, slightly judgy interpretations might have suggested. Rather, it was a sum of wealth, livestock, silver, land paid by the groom's family to your father or guardian. It was a recognition of your value, and theoretically, it was meant to compensate your family for the loss of your labor and to provide for your financial security. Some scholars suggest a portion of this might have even become your personal property later on, though that's another area where the details are a bit fuzzy and much discuss. Then comes the wedding feast itself, the Breakup. This wasn't just a quick, I do, and a slice of cake. It was often a multi-day affair, a huge public celebration involving feasting, drinking, copious amounts of mead and ale, naturally, ritual proclamations, and the formal exchange of gifts. It was here the oaths were sworn, binding not just you and your new husband, but your entire kin groups together. Imagine the noise, the smell of roasting meat, the boisterous laughter, the skalds reciting poetry, the weight of expectation. And as the bride, you're at the center of it all, probably feeling a mixture of excitement, trepidation, and the distinct awareness that this is a major turning point, a shift in your allegiances and your daily life. And after the feasting and the formal joining, there was often another significant financial element, the morgengifu, or morning gift. This was a gift given directly from the husband to you, the wife, on the morning after the marriage was consummated. It was yours to keep, your personal property, a token of the new bond and perhaps a little something for your troubles, if you catch my drift. The value of the morning gift could vary enormously, from a piece of jewelry to a significant piece of land, and it often reflected the status of both families. It's a rather intimate and interesting custom, isn't it? A sort of ancient, thank you for joining my longhouse, and my bed. It acknowledged you, in a very direct way, as his wife. So, as you settle into your new home, remember that your presence there is the result of many conversations, many calculations, and quite a few clinking coins or lowing cows. Alright. So the feasting is done, the oaths have been sworn, and the morning gift has been duly presented. Hopefully it was a good one, perhaps a nice silver brooch. Or if you're really lucky, a small flock of easily managed sheep. You're now officially the husfrage of this new longhouse. Or perhaps you've remained in your childhood home, and your husband has moved in, though that was less common. Either way, those symbolic keys we talked about earlier are now firmly in your grasp. Or perhaps a new set has been bestowed upon you by your mother-in-law with a look that says, "Don't mess this up, dear." Your days quickly fall into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the household, as we touched upon. You are the undisputed manager of the internal world of the longhouse. The food stores, the dried fish, the salted meat, the bins of grain, the precious honey are all under your lock and key. You decide who eats what, and how much. This was no small power in a world where a harsh winter, or a failed harvest, could mean the difference between comfort and starvation. You're also in charge of the textiles. Weaving was a constant, vital activity. From the coarse vermeil, the woolen cloth, that was so standardized it was actually used as a form of currency. Imagine paying your taxes in a neatly folded bolt of fabric. To finer linens and more decorative pieces, the production of cloth was a significant economic contribution, and it was entirely women's work. The rhythmic thud of the warp-weighted loom would have been another constant sound in the longhouse, a soundtrack to your daily authority. This domestic power was very real. The sagas are full of capable, sometimes formidable, husfrages who run their farms with iron wills, especially when their husbands are off doing Viking things like discovering North America by accident, or getting into complicated blood feuds. But what about your personal freedoms, beyond the immediate sphere of the Longhouse and its adjoining lands? Here, things get a bit more subtly defined. You could own property independently, inherit it, and as we'll see, retain your dowry and mourning gift if the marriage dissolved. This was quite significant compared to many other European societies of the time. You could also, in theory, engage in some forms of trade with your own handcrafted goods or surplus produce. However, your movements and associations would still largely be within the context of your family and community. You wouldn't just pack a bag and go backpacking across Norway, charming as that sounds. Your honor, and by extension, your family's honor, was a serious business. An obscure legal point, but quite telling. If your husband, for instance, tried to sell or give away significant household items or livestock that were considered part of the communal marital property without your consent, particularly things under your direct management, you might actually have grounds to object or even seek redress. The keeper of the keys wasn't just a symbolic title. It sometimes came with a measure of real legal standing over the household's assets. Some scholars argue that this right to protect household property from a spendthrift or foolish husband was one of the more underappreciated aspects of a Viking woman's power. Yet, the question of how much of this domestic power translated into public influence, especially when your husband was present and accounted for, is where historians often pull up their chairs for a good, long debate. Was your husband genuinely consulting you on major decisions? Or were you more of a highly respected chief operating officer executing his grand vision? The sagas offer conflicting portrayals. Some women are shown to be incredibly influential, advising their husbands, goading them into action, or sometimes, into very unwise blood feuds, and acting as shrewd political players in their own right. Others seem more confined to the domestic sphere, albeit a powerful one. It likely came down to a combination of personality, the specific dynamics of your marriage, your husband's temperament, and the strength of your own natal kin, your birth family. How actively did your father and brothers continue to look out for your interests and well-being after you were married? Their continued support, or lack thereof, could significantly tip the scales of your influence and security within your new marriage. That ongoing connection to your birth family was a crucial lifeline, a reminder that you weren't just absorbed into your husband's clan, but remained a daughter and sister of another. So, you're competently managing the Longhouse, the keys are a familiar weight at your side, and you're a respected figure within your little world. Life is, well, it's life in the Viking Age. Full of hard work, the ever-present scent of wood smoke, and the knowledge that a peaceful day is a good day. But let's be honest, even the best managed Longhouse, with the most meticulously woven vermeil and the plumpest chickens, isn't immune to the kinds of human troubles that can fray the edges of any marriage, in any era. The hearthside shadows can lengthen, and troubles can, and often do, brew. What kind of grievances could possibly sour a Viking marriage enough to make you, or your equally Viking husband, think about the unthinkable actually ending it? Well, some of them are depressingly timeless. One of the most commonly cited grounds for divorce, which either party could initiate, was if a spouse failed in their fundamental duties. For your husband, this often meant a failure to provide adequately for the household. If he was persistently lazy, a terrible hunter, a hapless farmer, or just plain unlucky in his trading ventures, and you and the children were consistently going hungry or lacking basic necessities while he, I don't know, spent his days carving increasingly unimpressive wooden squirrels, that could be a serious issue. Your to-do list is already a mile long. You're not looking to support a freeloader, however charming his squirrel carvings might be. Physical abuse was another major one, and importantly, this was a ground on which you, as the wife, could specifically seek a divorce. The law codes, like the Gragas from Iceland, are quite clear that if a man struck his wife, she had the right to leave him. Now, how many strikes, and how severe they had to be, is something historians still pick apart and debate. Was one slap in anger enough, or did it require a pattern of abuse? The saga suggests that public honor was so paramount that even a single unjustified strike against a woman by her husband could bring immense shame upon him and his kin, potentially giving her family grounds to support her in seeking a separation. It wasn't just about the physical act, but the dishonor it represented. Then there's the issue of infidelity. While Viking men, particularly those of high status, often had concubines or consorted with thrall women, a rather grim reality of the power dynamics, bringing a mistress into the shared home, or openly flaunting an affair in a way that deeply shamed you, his legitimate wife and husfreyja, could be cause for you to say, right, that's it. I'm taking my dowry and my dignity and I'm off. For a man to seek divorce from his wife on grounds of her infidelity, it was usually a much more straightforward affair, carrying severe social consequences for the adulterous wife. The double standard was, sadly, alive and well even amongst the fjords. Male impotence or inability to perform his, shall we say, husbandly duties, was also a recognized reason for a wife to seek divorce. A marriage was, after all, about procreation and continuing the family line as much as it was about anything else. If that fundamental aspect was missing, the contract was, in a sense, unfulfilled. One rather obscure, or perhaps, just bluntly practical, ground for divorce was if your husband simply couldn't satisfy you, or if he engaged in practices you found, well, Viking-like in the bedchamber. Though proving that one at the local thing might have involved some rather awkward testimonies, one imagines. Here's a quirky one for you. A husband could also risk his marriage if he composed satirical or insulting verses about his wife or her family, a practice known as enlighten. Words had immense power in Norse society. To be publicly shamed or ridiculed in verse, especially in a way that stuck and was repeated, was a profound insult that could damage honor irreparably. So, if your Viking husband fancied himself a bit of a comedic poet, and his jokes about your mother's terrible stew went too far, that wasn't just a domestic tiff. It could actually be grounds for you to pack your things. The power of a well-aimed insult, something to consider next time you're crafting a witty comeback. And of course, there was desertion. If your husband, just up and left, went on a Viking adventure, and conveniently forgot the way home for, say, 3 years, or more, you were generally free to consider the marriage over, and could potentially remarry. The specifics of how long constituted desertion, and how it was proven are, naturally, fodder for ongoing scholarly discussion. Was it 3 Scandinavian winters, which feel like an eternity, or 3 calendar years? Details. But the core idea was that a marriage required both parties to be present and participating. If one simply vanished into the mists, the other wasn't expected to wait indefinitely. So, the mead has gone sour in your marriage. Perhaps your Viking husband has developed an unfortunate fondness for composing insulting poems about your prized turnip patch. Or maybe he's just proven to be spectacularly bad at the whole providing for the family gig. You've endured the smoky longhouse, the endless chores, the distinct lack of personal space, but now this. Whatever the reason, a thought, initially perhaps as faint as a distant raven's call, begins to solidify in your mind. What if you didn't have to put up with this? What if there was a way out? This isn't just a modern daydream of packing your bags and calling a friend with a couch. This is the Viking Age, and the concept of actually ending a marriage, for a woman to initiate it, feels, well, it probably feels pretty radical, even to you. Yet, here's the kicker, the truly surprising part of this whole Norse saga, divorce, or skilna, was a recognized legal possibility. And not just for men. You, as a Viking woman, had the right to seek a divorce under specific circumstances. This is a mainstream historical fact that often catches people by surprise, given the generally patriarchal nature of most ancient and medieval societies. While your daily life was certainly circumscribed by customs and expectations, when it came to the dissolution of a marriage that had gone fundamentally wrong, Norse law offered you a door, albeit one that required a firm and public push. The very idea that you, a woman, could stand up and say, "This isn't working, and I'm ending it," was quite a departure from, say, many parts of contemporary Christian Europe, where marriage was increasingly seen as an indissoluble sacrament. Down there, you'd pretty much have to hope your problematic spouse conveniently fell off a horse, or choked on a chicken bone if you wanted out. But here, in the North, things were a bit more pragmatic. A marriage was a contract, a worldly agreement between two families. And if the terms of that contract were grievously breached, then the contract could, theoretically, be voided. But how did this whisper of freedom translate into actual action? It wasn't a quiet chat over a cup of weak ale. If you decided to pursue a divorce, you couldn't just, change your relationship status on whatever the Viking equivalent of social media was, probably a very loudly carved rune stone placed in a prominent village location. No, you had to make your intentions known, clearly and publicly. One rather fascinating, if somewhat obscure, detail that emerges from the law codes, particularly the Icelandic gragas, is the specific ritual often required for declaring divorce. It wasn't enough to just feel wronged, you had to act. You, the aggrieved wife, would typically need to summon witnesses, reliable, free men, often including your own male relatives if they were supportive. Then, at a significant place, you would formally declare your reasons for divorcing your husband. And get this, that significant place could be the threshold of your shared house, or even, according to some interpretations, by the side of your marital bed. Imagine the scene, you standing there, your voice perhaps trembling but firm, with your kinsman at your back, listing the grievances. "He struck me, he failed to provide, he brought shame upon our household by wearing a shirt so low-cut it would make a Frankish dancing girl blush." You'd then declare yourself divorced from him. This public declaration, before witnesses, was a crucial step. It wasn't just a personal decision. It was a legal act with immediate social consequences. Of course, the very idea of divorce, even if legally possible, carried its own weight. Was it common? Historians still sift through the sagas and legal texts, trying to gauge the frequency. It probably wasn't an everyday occurrence, or undertaken lightly. Marriage was still the bedrock of society, and a divorce would have ripples, affecting not just you and your husband, but both your extended families, property arrangements, and any children involved. There might have been considerable social pressure to try and reconcile, to endure, especially if the grievances weren't seen as severe enough by the wider community. Was it viewed as a personal failure, a tragedy, or simply a practical, if unfortunate, necessity in certain cases? The answer is likely all of the above, depending on the circumstances and the individuals involved. But the crucial point is that the option was there, a recognized legal pathway, a whisper that could, with courage and support, become a clear, resounding declaration of independence. And that, in the context of its time, was pretty extraordinary. The thought of divorce, once a mere whisper in the smoky recesses of the Longhouse, has now taken root. You've considered the indignities, the failures, the broken terms of your marital contract, and you're contemplating taking that very public, very definitive step. But this isn't a decision you'd likely make in a vacuum, stewing in your own resentment, until you dramatically announce your intentions by the bedside. No, in the tight-knit, kin-based society of the Vikings, you'd almost certainly seek counsel first. But who do you turn to when the most important worldly contract of your life is crumbling? Your first and most crucial port of call would be your own natal kin, your father, if he's still alive and kicking, and not off on a 3-year tour of the vulgar trade routes, your brothers, perhaps a powerful uncle, or even an older, respected sister. This is a mainstream historical understanding. Your birth family didn't just wash their hands of you once you were married off with a dowry and a hearty feast. They retained an interest, and often a responsibility, for your well-being. They had, after all, invested in this alliance too. If you were being mistreated or your husband was failing spectacularly, it reflected poorly on them as well, suggesting they'd made a bad match, or couldn't protect their own. You'd lay out your grievances to them, likely in hushed, serious tones, perhaps during a visit back to your childhood home, or by sending a trusted messenger if distance was a factor. Their reaction would be critical. If they supported your cause, they could provide not just emotional backing, but also practical help, protection, advocacy, and the all-important male witnesses and representatives you'd need if things escalated to a formal declaration, or a hearing at the thing. Imagine confiding in your eldest brother, a man known for his stern but fair judgment. You detail your husband's neglect, his sharp words, perhaps even a blow struck in anger. Your brother listens, his brow furrowed, his hand perhaps resting on the hilt of the Sikhs at his belt, a common sidearm, not necessarily a threat, just there. His support could make all the difference, lending weight and credibility to your claims. Conversely, if your family felt your reasons were flimsy, or if they valued the alliance with your husband's family too highly to risk a breach, they might counsel patience, or try to mediate a reconciliation. This is where the sagas often get juicy, with families torn between loyalty to their kinswoman and the pragmatic considerations of power and property. Historians continue to debate just how unconditional this natal kin support was. Was it an absolute right? Or did it depend heavily on your family's status, your personal reputation, and the severity of your husband's transgressions? Beyond your immediate family, you might also seek the ear of community elders, or respected local figures. Perhaps there's an older woman in the village, a widow known for her sharp mind and knowledge of the old ways, someone who has seen many marriages bloom and wither. Her advice, though not legally binding, might offer perspective or practical strategies for dealing with your errant spouse. Or consider this, a slightly more obscure, or perhaps speculative avenue, the vulva or spokona, the seeress or wise woman. While their main role was often divination and ritual, it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that a distressed wife might seek such a figure for more personal, perhaps even magically tinged counsel, or a glimpse into whether her path to freedom would be successful. The sagas are certainly full of powerful female figures who operate on the fringes of the normal social structure, wielding a different kind of influence. However, relying on a prophecy to sort out your marital woes was probably a bit of a long shot compared to the solid backing of a few burly brothers. There might also have been informal attempts at mediation within the community. Before dragging everything out into the very public arena of the thing, respected neighbors, or the local chieftain might try to sit down with you and your husband, to hear both sides, and to see if some accord could be reached. A bit like ancient marriage counseling, but with more furs and probably a higher chance of someone storming out to sharpen an axe. The goal would be to restore harmony if possible, or at least to manage the separation, with minimal public drama, and potential for escalating feud if harmony was a lost cause. So, as you contemplate your next move, you're not entirely alone. You're part of a web of relationships, and the quality of the advice and support you receive from this network could very well determine whether that whisper of freedom becomes a reality, or fades back into the smoky silence of an unhappy home. You've sought counsel from your kin, weighed the advice, and your resolve has hardened like winter ice on the fjord. The informal mediations, if any were attempted, have failed to mend the gaping hole in your marriage. Now, it's time for action, for that public declaration we spoke of. But what exactly can you, a Viking woman, stand up and legitimately accuse your husband of, in a way that the law and your community will recognize as valid grounds for severing the marriage bond? It's not just about feeling generally fed up, or drifting apart, as we might say today. You need concrete, legally recognized grievances. As we've touched upon, one of the most significant grounds, and a mainstream historical fact recorded in the law codes, was physical abuse. If your husband struck you, the Gragas mentions specifically 3 blows, though some interpretations vary, you had the right to declare yourself divorced. This wasn't about, he said, she said in private. Ideally, these acts of violence would have been witnessed, or the results of them, bruises, injuries, visible enough to lend credence to your claim when you brought it before your witnesses, and if necessary, the thing. The dishonor this brought upon him was often as damaging as the physical act itself. For a man to be known as a wife-beater was a serious stain on his reputation. Failure to provide, or matlisi, literally a lack of food, was another big one. Your husband had a fundamental duty to keep the longhouse stocked and the family fed. If he was, as we imagined earlier, more interested in his avant-garde squirrel carvings than in hunting, fishing, farming, or trading successfully, and as a result, you and the children were facing genuine hardship, not just a lean period, but persistent want that was a breach of the marriage contract. This makes a lot of practical sense, doesn't it? In a harsh environment, a provider who doesn't provide is a liability the household, and by extension the community, can ill afford. Desertion, as mentioned before, was also clear grounds. If he sailed off for greener pastures, or richer raiding grounds, and didn't return within a specified period, usually around 3 years, you were considered free to divorce and remarry. He'd effectively abandoned his responsibilities, and you weren't expected to live like a widow indefinitely if there was no confirmation of his death. Now for some of the more specific, and perhaps to our modern ears, slightly quirky grounds. Prepare for a little historical here. One of the most talked about, and genuinely documented, reasons a woman could divorce her husband was if he wore clothing considered effeminate, or shameful for a man. Yes, you heard that correctly. If your Viking man developed a penchant for, say, shirts with an overly deep V-neck that showed off a bit too much chest hair, or lack thereof, or if he favored overly soft, or ostentatiously foreign fabrics that were deemed unmanly, this wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It could be a legitimate cause for divorce. The reasoning: such attire brought urge or arga, a complex term implying unmanliness, perversion, and cowardice upon him, and by extension, shame upon you and the household. It was a matter of public honor. So, if he started borrowing your silk undershirts, you had an out. Historians still debate exactly what constituted effeminate clothing and how often this was actually invoked, but it's definitely there in the legal texts, a fascinating insight into Norse concepts of masculinity and honor. Another ground could be if he made slanderous verses, as we discussed, not just about you, but specifically about your male relatives, your father or brothers. This was a grave insult to their honor, and by extension, to yours. It was an attack on your kin, and you had the right to sever ties with a man who would so publicly shame your family. Similarly, if he was proven to be plotting against your kin, that was a no-go. Impotence, or the inability to father children, remained a valid reason. And beyond that, if he was found to be not performing his marital duties in a way that was considered satisfactory, or normal, by prevailing standards, though how this was defined or proven is, again, a matter of some rather delicate historical speculation. The law codes could be surprisingly direct about such intimate matters. The public declaration itself was key. You had to name your husband, state your grounds clearly before your chosen witnesses, often at the main door of your house, or by your bed, or at the public assembly the thing, and declare that you were, by this act, divorced from him. It was a powerful performative act. The exact wording and ritual might have varied slightly by region or over time, but the principle of a public, witness declaration of specific, legally recognized grievances was central. And the consistency of application of these laws across different social strata, or remote fjords. That's where the academic debates get really lively, trying to piece together the lived reality from the written codes. So, picture this, you on your way to the thing. It's not a building, not in the way we think of a courthouse. It's usually a designated outdoor site, the prominent field, a sacred mound, perhaps marked by standing stones. This is where the free people of the district gather, at set times of the year to settle legal disputes, make new laws, or rather, affirm existing ones, as law was largely tradition, and generally catch up on all the important community business, and let's be honest, probably a good bit of gossip too. It's part parliament, part courtroom, part social festival. As you approach, you see tents and temporary shelters dotting the landscape, smoke rising from cooking fires, the murmur of many voices, the neighing of horses. It's a bustling, slightly chaotic scene, but with an undercurrent of serious purpose. The mainstream historical understanding is that these things, from local assemblies to the great all-thing in Iceland, were the cornerstone of Norse governance and law. Here, disputes weren't settled by a king's decree from on high, at least not in the earlier periods, or in places like Iceland, which prided itself on its commonwealth structure. Instead, they were aired publicly, and judgments were often reached through a process involving argument, presentation of evidence by both sides, the swearing of oaths, and the deliberation of a panel of local chieftains, or respected landowners, often called gore in Iceland. Your divorce case, if contested or complex, would be on the agenda. No pressure, right? You'd likely be accompanied by your male kinsman, your father, brothers, uncles, who would act as your advocates and supporters. Their presence, their numbers, and their reputation would unfortunately, but realistically, carry some weight. It's a slightly less romantic image than a lone, brave woman fighting for her rights, but it was the practical reality. One rather obscure detail that historians and archaeologists have pieced together concerns the layout and rituals of the thing. There might have been specific areas where certain groups sat, perhaps a law rock, or logberg from which the laws were recited annually. This recitation was crucial because, for a long time, much of Norse law was oral tradition, memorized and passed down by a lögsögumar, or law speaker. Imagine having to remember the entire legal code and recite it accurately every year. That's one heck of a public speaking gig, and definitely no room for ad-libbing. When your case is called, you, or more likely, your designated male relative acting as your spokesman, would state your claim and your grounds for divorce. Your husband, or his spokesman, would then present his counterarguments or defense. Witnesses would be called upon to swear oaths supporting either side. Evidence, such as it was, might be presented, perhaps showing injuries if abuse was claimed, or testimony about a husband's failure to provide. In some earlier or more ambiguous cases in Norse history, though less so for straightforward divorce claims based on established law, disputes could even be settled by a formal duel, or an ordeal, though these practices became less common and were viewed with increasing skepticism, especially as Christian influence grew. Thankfully, your divorce probably won't come down to you having to carry a hot iron to prove your husband wore an offensively frilly tunic. But here's where the academics love to roll up their sleeves and debate. How impartial was the thing, really? While the ideal was justice based on law and tradition, the reality was likely more complex. Could a powerful chieftain with a large retinue of armed followers subtly, or not so subtly, influence the judgment in his favor, or in favor of his kin? Almost certainly. Did wealth and status play a role in who was believed, or whose oaths were considered more weighty? It would be naive to think not. And once a judgment was given, say, the thing affirms your right to divorce and the return of your dowry, how was it enforced? There wasn't a formal police force in the Viking Age. Enforcement often relied on the social pressure of the community, the honor of the individuals involved, and, ultimately, the willingness of the wronged party's kin to back up the judgment, by force if necessary. So, while the thing spoke, making that judgment stick sometimes required a whole other level of determination. Alright, the thing has spoken. Maybe it was a straightforward process, your grounds for divorce clear, and your husband surprisingly agreeable, unlikely, but we can dream, can't we? Or perhaps it was a tense affair, with your brother giving your now ex-husband's spokesman the stink eye for 3 straight hours. Whatever the drama, let's assume the judgment has gone in your favor. You are officially, legally and very publicly, divorced. Congratulations! You've successfully navigated a complex social and legal minefield. Now, about the stuff, because as in any separation, ancient or modern, the division of property and assets is a pretty big deal. You're not just walking away with your dignity, you have legal entitlements. The most crucial of these, and a well-established mainstream historical fact, is the return of your munda, your dowry, or bride price, that your family originally received, and your morgengifu, that morning gift your husband gave you after the wedding night. These were considered your personal property, or at least property, to which you had a primary claim upon the dissolution of the marriage, especially if your husband was deemed at fault, or if you divorced him on legitimate grounds. This was hugely significant. It meant you weren't left destitute. You had resources, a financial foundation to start anew. This financial independence, or at least partial independence, is one of the standout features of a Viking woman's legal position compared to many of her contemporaries in other parts of the world. You're not just relying on the charity of your male relatives, you have a claim to what's yours. But it's not always as simple as him just handing over a bag of silver and your favorite sheep. What about the property that was accumulated during the marriage? The new loom you wove tirelessly on, the extra fields cleared and cultivated through your joint efforts, or mostly your efforts, while he was perfecting his new, even more offensive shirt design, the livestock that multiplied under your care. This is where things could get a bit more complicated, and where you might find some rather obscure and debated legal nuances. The law codes attempted to lay out how communally acquired wealth, the FE or movable goods, and sometimes even land improvements, should be divided. Generally, the idea was a fair split, but fair can be a very flexible term. There were distinctions between what was considered your personal property, his personal property, perhaps items he inherited or brought into the marriage separately, and the common marital estate. For instance, if your husband was clearly at fault for the divorce, say, he was the one who got caught wearing the notorious frilly shirt, or he was the one who struck you, the financial settlement might be more favorable to you. Conversely, if you were deemed to be at fault, a much harder case to make if you were the one initiating based on his transgressions. But let's imagine a hypothetical scenario where a wife was divorced for, say, proven adultery. You might risk forfeiting some of your claims, possibly your mourning gift, or even, in extreme cases, a portion of your dowry, though this latter point is something historians debate quite vigorously. The prevailing idea seems to be that the dowry was strongly protected for the woman. Consider the process of actually valuing everything. How do you put a price on 3 years of expertly woven vermeil, or the improved yield from a field due to your diligent manuring efforts? Glamorous, I know. There would have been negotiations, assessments, perhaps even appointed assessors from the community if you couldn't agree. It could be a drawn-out, stressful process. And this is where another debate amongst historians often arises. How often were women actually able to recover their full entitlements, especially if the divorce was acrimonious, or if her natal family wasn't particularly powerful, or inclined to press her claims forcefully? The law might say one thing, but the practical ability to enforce it against a reluctant or powerful ex-husband could be another matter entirely. Having strong, supportive kinsmen was, once again, absolutely invaluable. They weren't just there for moral support at the thing. They were there to make sure you got your fair share of the sheep and silver. It's a bit like having a very serious, very Viking legal team and collection agency rolled into one. So as you stand there, free but perhaps a little emotionally battered, your next big challenge is ensuring that your fresh start is also a financially secure one. The property has been, more or less, divided. You've reclaimed your dowry, your mourning gift is safely stashed, perhaps it was that nice silver brooch after all, or a couple of sturdy cows, practical, and you've got your share of the marital pots and sheep. You're free. But if your marriage produced children, those little young ravens, as they might poetically be called, their fate is now a pressing concern. What happens to them when their parents, whose union was meant to be a lifelong alliance, have officially called it quits. This is, as you can imagine, a sensitive area, and one where the details in the historical record are often more about custom and practical negotiation than rigidly defined laws. One mainstream understanding is that the legitimacy of your children was generally not affected by your divorce. They were still considered the legitimate offspring of both parents, with rights to inherit from both, provided the marriage itself was legally recognized in the first place. This is important. Unlike in some other societies where divorce could cast a shadow on the children's status, Norse custom seemed more focused on lineage and kinship ties, which weren't so easily severed by marital breakdown. So, your little Bjorn and Astrid aren't suddenly outcasts. They still belong to both your kin groups. But who do they live with? This is where things become less clear-cut, and more dependent on individual circumstances, negotiation, and prevailing customs, which likely varied. There wasn't a formal custody battle in the modern sense, with lawyers presenting arguments about the best interests of the child before a bewigged judge. It was probably far more pragmatic. Very young children, especially infants who were still nursing, would almost certainly stay with you, their mother. This is just practical, and a near-universal custom across cultures. For older children, it could depend on a variety of factors. Sometimes, they might remain with the parent who stayed in the original family home or farmstead, often the father if he retained the primary ancestral land. Other times, especially if you, the mother, were seen as the wronged party and had a secure place to go, perhaps back to your own prosperous natal family, the children might go with you. Here's a somewhat more obscure aspect to consider: the pervasiveness of fostering, fosterbrorlag for foster brotherhood, but fostering children was broader in Norse society. It was very common for children, even from intact and loving families, to be sent to live with other relatives, or with a family of higher status, for a period of their upbringing. This was done to strengthen kinship ties, to provide the child with different skills, or a broader social network, or sometimes just to ease the burden on a household with too many mouths to feed. So, in the context of a divorce, it's quite possible that your children might not end up living exclusively with either you or your ex-husband, but could be fostered with a respected uncle, a grandmother, or another suitable guardian. This could also be a way to ensure they maintain strong ties with both sides of their now divided family. The financial responsibility for the children is another area where historians sift through sagas and legal fragments for clues. If the children lived primarily with you, was your ex-husband expected to contribute to their upkeep? The law codes are not always explicit on what we'd call child support. However, given the strong emphasis on kin responsibility, it's likely there was a customary expectation that both parents and their respective families would ensure the children were provided for. The specifics: who paid for their new shoes, who contributed a sheep to their starter flock when they came of age, were probably worked out on a case-by-case basis, heavily influenced by the relative wealth and status of the families and the nature of the divorce settlement. If your ex-husband was a man of honor, even if a terrible husband, he'd likely want to ensure his offspring weren't seen to be neglected. And this brings us to a point of ongoing debate. Was there any clear legal or customary preference for maternal or paternal custody for older children, assuming all else was equal? The sagas provide a patchwork of examples. Sometimes children stay with the mother, sometimes with the father, sometimes they are divided between households. It suggests a degree of flexibility, perhaps prioritizing where the child could be best cared for, or where their future prospects, like inheritance or advantageous fostering, might be brightest. It's unlikely there was a one-size-fits-all rule. The future of your young ravens would be a matter of serious discussion, a negotiation where your voice, backed by your kin and your acclaimed financial standing, would hopefully carry significant weight in ensuring their well-being, even as your own path diverged from that of their father. The dust from the thing has settled, the division of property is complete, You made sure to get back that particularly good wool comb he kept trying to use for his beard. The audacity and arrangements for the children, your young ravens, have been made. You stand at a threshold, not just of a long house, but of a new chapter in your life. You are a divorced woman in Viking society. So, what now? Do you retire to a quiet corner of your brother's farm, and take up competitive sorrow knitting? Or is there a vibrant life still to be lived, new paths to be forged? The good news, and this is a pretty solid mainstream historical understanding, is that divorced women in Norse society could, and very often did, remarry. Divorce didn't necessarily render you a social pariah, especially if you were the one who initiated it on legitimate grounds, and your honor remained intact. You weren't damaged goods in the way women in some other contemporary cultures might have been perceived after a marriage ended. You had your dowry back, your mourning gift, perhaps a share of the marital property. You were a woman of means, an independent agent with assets. This, in itself, would have made you an attractive prospect for a new marriage. A woman bringing her own wealth and proven household management skills to a union. That's a Viking-era catch, right there. But what about the social nuances? Was there any lingering stigma? This is where things get a little more subtle, and perhaps a bit more speculative. An obscure consideration might be why the divorce happened. If you divorced your husband because he was, say, abusive or a terrible provider, you'd likely have the sympathy and support of the community. Your standing might even be enhanced by your courage in extricating yourself from a bad situation. If, however, and this would be rare for a woman to be the at-fault party in a divorce she didn't initiate, given the grounds were usually based on the husband's failings, if she was the plaintiff, the divorce was due to some scandal on your part, then yes, your reputation, and therefore your remarriage prospects, might suffer. But generally, for a woman who left a marriage honorably, the path to remarriage seems to have been relatively open. You might choose to return to your natal family for a time, regrouping and considering your options. Or, if your financial standing allowed, you might even maintain your own household, though this would be less common unless you were a particularly wealthy widow, or a divorcee with substantial independent means. More likely, a new marriage proposal wouldn't be too long in coming, especially if you were still of childbearing age. Your family would once again be involved in the negotiations, perhaps even more keen this time to ensure a good match, having learned from past experiences. You, too, would likely be a more discerning participant in the process, older, wiser, and perhaps a little less inclined to be swayed by a charming smile, if it wasn't backed by a decent flock of sheep and a reputation for not wearing offensively frilly shirts. Historians often debate the extent to which a woman's previous marital status affected the type of second marriage she might make. Could she still command a high bride price? Would she be sought after by men of similar or higher status? Or would she be more likely to marry a widower, or someone of slightly lesser standing? It probably depended heavily on her age, her wealth, the power of her kin, and her reputation. A wealthy, well-connected divorcee from a powerful family could likely still make a very advantageous second match. Someone with fewer resources or less influential kin might have fewer, or different, options. But the key thing is that options existed. You weren't simply shelved. Life anew might also mean a change in location, a move to a different farmstead, even a different region, if your new husband hailed from further afield. It would mean forging new relationships with a new set of in-laws, establishing your authority in a new household. But you'd do so with the experience of your previous marriage behind you, both the good and the bad. You'd know your own capabilities, your own worth, and importantly, you'd know the law was, to a surprising extent, on your side when it came to protecting your rights and your property. So, as you stand there, contemplating your next step, the path isn't one of shame or obscurity. It's a path that acknowledges the past, but looks firmly towards a future where you, a capable and resourceful Norse woman, can continue to shape your own destiny, perhaps finding a partnership that this time truly honors the binding oaths. So, you've walked this path, from the initial whispers of discontent in a smoky longhouse to potentially finding a new hearth, a new partner, armed with the knowledge of your rights and your own resilience. This journey through the world of Viking divorce, with its surprisingly progressive rules, paints a fascinating picture of a society that, for all its harshness and warrior ethos, had some rather enlightened corners, especially concerning a woman's agency within and exiting marriage. But all sagas, even the ones we live, eventually reach a new chapter, and the unique legal landscape you navigated wasn't destined to last forever in its original form. The eventual fading of these distinctly Norse divorce customs is a mainstream historical understanding, primarily linked to the gradual, but inexorable process of Christianization throughout Scandinavia, which took place over several centuries, roughly from the 8th to the 12th century, and even later in some more remote areas. As the new faith, with its centralized church structure, and its different set of marital doctrines, took root, it began to overlay, and eventually supplant, many of the older pagan legal traditions. The Christian view of marriage as a sacrament, an indissoluble union ordained by God, except in very specific and limited circumstances, usually requiring church annulment rather than civil divorce, was quite different from the Norse contractual view. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, is a rather different vibe from you wore a shirt with too many frills. So I'm citing paragraph 3 of the Local Things bylaws. This transition wasn't an overnight switch. It was a slow burn, a period of overlap and sometimes, one imagines, considerable confusion, or even resistance. Imagine a local community where for generations, divorce by mutual consent, or for specific grievances, was accepted practice. Then, a newly arrived priest starts telling everyone that marriage is for life, no exceptions, and only the church, in some far-off place, can even begin to discuss ending it. That would have been a significant cultural shift. An obscure, or at least less commonly highlighted, aspect of this period might be the persistence of older, pagan-influenced legal ideas in local customs, or among families who were slower to fully embrace the new religious doctrines. Did some communities quietly continue to practice a form of separation and remarriage that wasn't officially sanctioned by the church, but was accepted locally? It's quite possible, though hard to trace definitively in the records, which were increasingly kept by ecclesiastical authorities. Historians often debate the speed and uniformity of this legal transformation. Did a powerful king converting to Christianity suddenly change all the marriage laws across his entire realm? Unlikely. It was more likely a piecemeal process, stronger in urban centers and around new bishoprics, perhaps slower to penetrate the more isolated rural fjords and valleys where old ways died hard. There might have been fascinating hybrid situations, where local secular laws still allowed for property settlements reminiscent of the Old Norse system, even if the church frowned upon the actual divorce and remarriage. Some scholars also explore whether certain underlying principles from Norse law, such as a woman's right to own and inherit property, or her protected status regarding her dowry, managed to survive in some form and subtly influence later Scandinavian legal codes, even as the specific divorce practices changed. It's like an echo in the legal system, a faint reminder of a time when things were done differently. So, as you, our time-traveling Viking woman, reflect on this era, you're looking at a unique window in legal history. For a period, in this particular corner of the world, women possessed a degree of marital autonomy and access to divorce that was quite remarkable for its time, arguably more so than in many more civilized parts of contemporary Europe. These laws weren't perfect. They operated within a deeply patriarchal society, and their application certainly depended on status and kin support. But they were there. They offered a measure of protection, a path to independence, and a recognition that a woman's well-being and her contribution to society mattered. As the sagas themselves eventually fell silent, or were rewritten through a new cultural lens, these specific legal nuances also receded, becoming another layer in the complex archaeology of law and custom. But the echoes of those strong-willed husfragers, demanding their rights, by the longhouse door, or before the thing, still resonate, if you listen closely enough.